Hi guys, welcome to lesson 3E, I believe the final lesson for this third unit of the AP Lang course. And it's a bit of a doozy because on the one hand, it's some of the most important stuff that we're going to talk about, but on the other hand, I don't really expect you to know it. And what I mean by I don't really expect you to know it is kind of what I'm talking about in this first bullet point here that I'll get to a little bit more concretely in a second, in that this isn't the kind of stuff that I ever want you to memorize. It's the stuff that I want you to be able to do. It's not the stuff that anybody expects you to memorize. And we'll talk about that in just a couple of moments. What is it? Well, it's the notable MLA protocols. Obviously, after having spent some time in the last couple of lessons talking about documentation and citations and things of that sort, we need to actually know, well, what are they and how do they work? And I understand that most of you know what they are. In addition to how they work, it's the nitty-gritty details that you probably don't have memorized and that, like I said, I don't expect you to have them memorized. So I'm just going to be covering some of the basics here today. And one of the things that, I'm going to repeatedly bring to your attention is just use the Purdue OWL. Which I'm sure that I brought up to you in class on occasion before, and that I certainly will again and again and again and again and again, because that has the most up-to-date information of all of this content. So without any further ado, let's dive into this, okay? So starting with this bullet point, which sort of takes what I just said to a further level, it says, whether you are an AP student, a college professor, or a dropout with a second grade education, no one is expected to memorize this stuff, okay? There is too much stuff for you to possibly memorize. Moreover, it changes constantly. In order to sell you a new copy of the MLA handbook every year, they change some rules. And so even if you did somehow manage to memorize how to do all 500 different works cited entries for a source, chances are they're going to change it a year from now, and everything that you memorize is going to be completely obsolete. So that's not something that you ever want to or need to do. And that holds true for all of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. This is the basics, the stuff as it stands right now that I want you to just sort of have in the back of your mind. But you can always use the Purdue OWL to help you understand this stuff. There's not going to be a situation in which I'm going to ask you anything too specific without the Purdue OWL at your disposal, particularly as you're constructing your own documentation, particularly as you're making your own texts and things of that sort, okay? So that's the big component of that I want you to think about right there. Why do we do this? Why do we teach it? Why do we bring it up? Well, this is what I do want you to know how to do. More importantly than having this stuff memorized, my goal is that you guys know how to use the resources at your disposal. As far as this class is concerned, the resource is going to be the Purdue OWL. When you get to a class in college that might require research-based writing, they might provide you with a textbook of sorts. Again, those textbooks have a tendency to be obsolete very shortly after they're published, so I don't see any reason for the school district to waste their money on something like that. But the goal ultimately is finding the resources that you need to answer the questions that you have, do things the correct way, not to memorize them, and be able to do them just off the cuff without any assistance from any prior resources. Anybody who does that is just wasting too much of their time and energy on something that is too fluctuating, and obviously I don't endorse that. So, all right, that's my little preamble there before we get into other things. That means a lot of this other stuff I can sort of draw your attention to and then maybe keep on moving a little bit more rapidly than I would with this quantity of content, because like I said, it's there to familiarize you with it. It's not there for you to learn it and memorize it and, record it rigidly in your mind, okay? So some things to keep in mind about MLA format. Remember, it should be in 12-point Times New Roman double-spaced for all things. All words on that page are 12-point Times New Roman double-spaced. So something to keep in mind in that front. Obviously, some people try to manipulate it, or the other thing is that the default setting for Google Docs isn't 12-point Times New Roman, which, is something that you're going to have to get in the habit of changing if you're not already in that habit, okay? Just in case you weren't familiar, and I know I've got a poster on my wall, and there's one accessible from those introductory documents back on the Google Classroom and whatnot. The first page, of course, should always have that MLA header up at the top, which starts with the author and then the instructor's name and then the course date and then the centered title. But then up in the header in the top right, you're going to have that last name and page number, of course. Just one thing to keep in mind about that as you're starting to do that kind of stuff, don't forget that if you do edit select all and then change the font to 12-point Times New Roman, that will not include content that's up there in the header. Okay, you need to specifically go in there and change that as well. So I get that error with a lot of my students. They've got everything in the appropriate font and font size, but not the header and footer content if there is any header and footer content. So just be aware of that and keep that in mind, okay? When we're talking about dates, specifically dates that are in that header, this is the format that we use. Notice that there is no comma. Notice also it starts with the day number, then the month. Notice also that it doesn't say 31st. It says 31 space December space 1981, and that's what your date should look like, okay? So no ists or ns or ths, and make sure that it's in that particular order without any additional punctuation. That's how MLA dates function, okay? Now, this number 5 is there to help you, to give you some introductory guidance. It's not something that you're going to want to come back to again and again and again and again and again. But if you're ever in a crunch, it's certainly one of those things can be super helpful. So that's why I present it to you. As you know, there are literally hundreds of different ways of making works cited entries. This is what the Purdue OWL provides for us as sort of the basic methodology. And by that I mean it's the one, as close to a universal rule. There is no universal rule, but it's the as close to universal rule as you can possibly get to when you're making a works cited entry, okay? So in such a situation, you'd be starting with the author and then the title of the source. If that source has a container, you'd be moving down to that. Any other contributors, perhaps a translator, perhaps an editor, whatever that situation might be. If there's a version number or a number for that particular text, you would use that, followed by the publisher, publication date, and location. Now, there is no hard and fast rule that applies to all of them. Like I said, this is a good jumping off point. When it comes down to it, and when you start to actually make your own works cited entries, anytime, but specifically for this class, you're going to need to go to the Purdue OWL and specifically say, okay, what kind of source do I have? What is the methodology for making a works cited entry for that particular kind of source? You can't use something like this. As great as that would be, as awesome as that would be, it's just a little too vague and it doesn't cover all of the subtleties that are going to pop up whenever you're making a works cited entry. That being said, like I said, it's a good jumping off point. The other things to note about this that are worth mentioning whenever you're making works cited entries is I did pay close attention as I was formatting this to have punctuation accurate as possible. So notice, after the author's name, it would be a period, a comma after the title of the container, comma after contributors, version, number, publisher, publication date, and then a period at the end for location. Those are deliberately input into this particular document, so just as a little reminder. So when you're using the Purdue OWL and you're using a more specific methodology for creating your works cited entries, don't neglect the punctuation that they have there. It's specifically and deliberately placed with the intentions of the MLA format in mind. Okay, I've also got these other little caveats thrown in the mix up here in brackets. In case you happen to forget, yes, we always put the author's last name first and then the first name. So something worth remembering in that case. Remember that the title of the source isn't necessarily going to be a small work. It's only going to be a small work if there is a container. But if it is a small work, then it's of course going to be in quotation marks. Remember, if it's a large work, it's going to be in italics. So just to put that into perspective, if there is a container of some sort, like if it's a collection of poems and you're using one poem, or if it's a collection of short stories and you're using one short story, that short story or poem is going to be in quotation marks. And then, of course, the collection name is going to be in italics. If you don't have a container, if it's just a straightforward book that isn't a collection of smaller things, well then obviously the C here, it wouldn't pop up in there in any fashion, and the source, the title of the source itself would be in italics because you don't have a container. So just some things to keep in mind there, all right? Some additional things that will often pop up, and you can sort of get the sense of when and where you might see these, especially B and C in this case. As you're getting into web sources and things of that sort, date of access is going to be a big deal. And just to reiterate why date of access is such a big deal, keep in mind that websites are fluid, web pages are fluid. So if you put down that, oh, well, I use this website, and I use this website which was published on October 15th of 2022, they might have updated or tweaked or changed that website after that particular date, which is why date of access becomes important. Because just because a website is published on one day doesn't mean it wasn't adjusted, manipulated, tweaked, fixed after that date. And so date of access becomes a big deal. City of publication, that's sort of a caveat, and you'll see more about that as you look at the Purdue OWL of when that's becomes relevant with things like books and stuff of that sort. And then, of course, URL. That just makes sense. You'd want to have that with a website. Interesting, it wasn't always. There were some years when MLA said, no, we don't want the URL, but it is back in fashion at this point, so it's one of those things you want to make sure you have, okay? Now, on the subject of internal citations, okay, under most circumstances, an internal citation should include in parentheses, and keep in mind, this is a long bullet point for the simple fact that I'm trying to give you a lot of nitty-gritty details in here. So as you may recall, internal citations go in parentheses, and they include that first word of the associated works cited entry in identical formatting. So if the first word of the works cited entry was in italics, then it needs to be in italics in the internal citation. If it was in quotation marks, then it needs to be in quotation marks in the internal citation. More likely than not, it's going to be an author's last name because that's usually the first word of the works cited entry. But whatever it happens to be in the works cited entry is the thing you plug into that internal citation, okay? And just as for the record, as with the works cited entries, you need to be consulting your Purdue OWL for every one of your internal citations. These are just the basics that can sort of guide you and give you some sense of, am I doing this right or am I doing this wrong? Okay? So internal citation should include in parentheses the first word of the associated works cited entry in identical formatting, followed by the page number, but only if it is a source that has consistent, universal, finite pagination. And what I mean by that is websites. I get a lot of students who think, I need a page number. I can't do this without a page number. So I'm using a website as a source. I need a page number. And then they put a page number in. And that page number isn't, as I would describe it, consistent, universal, and finite pagination. Either they just put 1, in which case, okay, where did you get the number 1? That's kind of arbitrary. You're assuming the page is 1 page long. Not necessarily how we roll with websites. The other thing is they might print it out and say, oh, well, this is from page 1 and this is from page 2. Okay, but everyone's printer and web browser is going to print that in a slightly different way, which is why it isn't necessarily consistent, universal, and finite. So you do not need page numbers with any text that doesn't have page numbers. Don't invent them. Don't try to force them in there. If something doesn't have a page number, it just doesn't have a page number. In that case, the internal citation is just going to be that first word of the works cited entry, okay? And then, of course, as it concludes here, the sentence's period will be after the end parenthesis, okay? That's pretty basic and straightforward in that case, all right? So, some additional things to talk about when we're talking about internal citations. When appropriate, the first word of the works cited entry, usually the author's name, but not always, can be relocated from the internal citation into the sentence itself. So if you were unfamiliar with that, that's a good tool to keep in mind. And it's a great tool, particularly if you want to establish ethos, okay? So if you think name dropping the person who wrote your source is going to really help you to develop ethos with your rhetoric, then you don't want to put it in the internal citation. You want to plug it into the sentence itself. That's perfectly okay. And so you can omit that name or whatever that first word of the works cited entry is from the parentheses and just put it into the sentence. And that means that either your parentheses just have a page number in it or they don't exist at all if there is no page number. So something worth noting there. And that's what I say in that second half to that sentence right there. Remember, you've also got this option of things like indirect quotations. What is an indirect quotation? Well, it's when an author you intend to quote is quoted in another author's work. And that happens a lot, okay? That happens, especially if you're using good sources that are going to pull from other good sources. You're going to encounter these situations where one person is going to quote another person, and you're going to think, man, I really want that quote, but the author of my source didn't actually say it. What do I do? Okay. Well, first thing to note about this is, if we do have a situation where we've got a quote within a quote, you should alternate between double and single quotation marks starting with double. That's what we do. So even if you have a situation, one of those goofy situations that sometimes you hear jokingly, like he said, she said, they said, Blanche said, Mike said, Francine said, that's exactly what you would do. You'd start with double quotes, then single quotes, then double quotes, then single quotes, then double quotes, then single quotes, and so on and so forth. And in the process, you would be acknowledging the fact that, okay, this all came from this quotation in this one place, but there's a sub-quotation embedded within it that came from a completely different place that I'm also acknowledging, okay? All right, let's bring it down then to number 2. So what happens next? Well, it says name the person whom the author cites in the sentence with the typical internal citation information at the end. So if you get this, if you get a quote from person B from person A's source, the internal citation at the end is still going to be what's normal for that source by person A. However, you do have to specifically mention person B's name within the body of that sentence itself. And that way we know, okay, this is coming from that person's source, but it was originally said by that person over there, okay? And part of what you use in order to communicate that information is, as it says, you're going to include the phrase QTDN inside the beginning of the internal citation. QTDN, of course, standing for quoted in, to indicate that the information within the sentence is arising within the specified source by another author. So again, keep in mind what that means for us. We're now giving credit to both speakers. The speaker of the person whose source you're using, which is embedded within that internal citation at the end, preceded, of course, by QTDN, but then the person who actually said the quote that source used, who is named in the sentence itself, okay? So, that's that. There are, of course, many other unusual circumstances with internal citations. Be sure to investigate the unusual situations that can govern MLA internal citations, just like I said with works cited entries, before committing to a one-size-fits-all approach. So like I said, these are the basics, these are the background, these are the things just to know the overview of this stuff. You should never be making them without having the Purdue OWL out and open and consulting that for the specific situation and type of text that you've got accessible to you, okay? Remember that in the absence of information required by a works cited entry, you should not be including a placeholder such as NA or anonymous. I get a lot of students who try to shoehorn that stuff in. I especially know that when people are using citation generators, we'll say, they have a tendency to plug those in, NA or anonymous or things like that. That doesn't fly in true MLA format, okay? So I'm not someone who is opposed to using a citation generator, but the reason I teach it nonetheless is that I need you to know when that citation generator gets things wrong. And one of the ways in which they very frequently get things wrong is by including NA when a piece of information has a tendency to be missing, okay? What we do instead is we just pretend as though it is not required and move on to the next available required information, okay? Web sources that are not duplications of previously printed documents do not have page numbers. I kind of already mentioned this. This is a good repetition note to make sure it's on the back of your mind. So don't speculate about page numbers based on a printout or some other inconsistent form of pagination. I mentioned that to you guys before, so please make sure that you're not making stuff up just so that you always have a page number in internal citation. That's not how things work, okay? The other big alternative that we've got at our disposal is the concept of a long quotation. And we define long quotation as any quotation that occupies 4 or more lines in length, okay? So if it gets onto a 4th line, you should automatically be in what we call block quote format, which is going to be a little bit different than a normal quotation just shoved into the scope of a line or 2 lines, okay? So some things to note about that. First off, it is going to start on a brand new line, though it's still part of the previous paragraph, okay? So to some extent, you're going to think, oh my gosh, is this going to be a new paragraph? No, it's still part of that previous paragraph, but it is going to start on a new line, okay? It is going to be indented an extra ½ an inch, but every single line of it is, and that's why it doesn't end up looking like a new paragraph, because it doesn't have an extra indent from the first line to the second line. All of the lines in that block quote are going to be indented the exact same quantity, which is an additional ½ inch, okay? The first word of the works cited entry must be embedded in the sentence leading up to the block quote. So under most circumstances, that sentence that is leading up to the block quote, that's part of this paragraph, is probably going to either end with a comma or a colon to indicate that you're about to present a quote to us. And whatever you would normally put into an internal citation as the first word of the works cited entry should absolutely positively be embedded within that sentence, okay? So that's something that's a little bit unusual. Remember, in other situations, it's an option that you've got at your disposal, but with a long quote, block quote situation, it's required. So something worth noting there. The period in this case does occur before the internal citation rather than after. So remember that within all of the other internal citations I was mentioning, the period comes after the internal citation. With the block quote, it comes right before. And remember, the only thing that internal citation is going to have inside of it in this case is the page number if there is one, okay? Because you've already used the first word of the works cited entry elsewhere in the text, okay? If that same paragraph is continuing after the block quote, the following line is not indented at all. And that's how you know that this is all one same continuous paragraph. So really the only thing, the indents that you would end up having to indicate this is one great big long paragraph is the normal indent at the beginning of the paragraph. But then you have those extra ½ inch indentations for the entire block quote. But then you come down to a new line and the paragraph continues without any indentation whatsoever. And that's one of those unique things that makes a block quote so different and identifiable. Again, just like with all this other stuff, don't make one unless you're consulting the Purdue OWL, because you don't have to memorize this. But you should know that it exists, how it exists, why it exists, and whether you're on the right track or not. Okay? Some final things to keep in mind on this topic. You can omit information in a quotation with an ellipsis as long as it does not materially alter the meaning of the passage. So maybe you've done this before, maybe you haven't, but ellipsis, of course, meaning the ... to let us know that, oh, you omitted some things in that context. As I mentioned, though, it shouldn't materially alter the meaning of the passage. That would be very dishonest. That would be a quick way to lose any ethos that you've generated during the course of your rhetoric. So certainly something that you want to keep in mind there. But if you feel like, well, it's kind of an aside, it doesn't add anything to it, it's just cluttering up my own words, it's just going to confuse my reader, and the omission of it doesn't change the meaning of the passage, by all means, feel like you can do that, okay? Now, the flip side of that is, yes, you can sometimes add or alter words, okay? You can add words or paraphrase words in quotation inside of brackets, again, as long as it does not materially alter the meaning of the passage. Maybe the passage includes some jargon that you don't think your audience is going to be familiar with. Okay, that's a good reason why someone might want to go ahead and paraphrase something in that case. That's perfectly fine. Or add a word for clarification. This should be in brackets, and that lets us know, okay, either you, as the author, changed what your source said, or added something to what your source said, and that way if you went in the original text, that wouldn't necessarily be there in the exact identical fashion, okay? A works cited page, which we haven't really talked about overall format and structure of works cited page, just as a little reminder, it should only include the words works cited centered at the top of the document, as well as the typical last name and page number, continuing from the last page of the essay. And just as a little rule of thumb for all of this stuff, I hate to break it to you, but it's boring, okay? Everything is boring. And, I say that's just at the top of the page. That's true. You generally know that you're doing works cited information. You generally know that you're doing MLA format correctly when it's as boring as humanly possible. And that means we're not playing around with fonts and font sizes and underlines and italics and bolds and bigger font and smaller font and extra spacing. No, when I said up above that everything is in 12-point Times New Roman, I meant that. When I said that everything is perfectly double-spaced, I meant that. That means everything. So the more boring it is, the more accurate it's going to be as well. So that works cited page is going to just have works cited up at the top. And of course, the document will continue with the last name and page number up there in the top right from whatever the previous page was of the essay. Okay. We are going to alphabetize the works cited entries by first word and use hanging indents for each. Remember, hanging indents are opposite of normal indents. In a normal indent, you indent the first line of a paragraph, right? That's what we all know. But with a hanging indent, you're going to indent every line of a paragraph except the first line. And just in case you've never sort of connected the dots before, part of the reason we do that is that means the first word of the works cited entry is always going to be poking its little head out the left-hand side. And if it's doing that, that means it's a lot easier for you to jump back and forth between, guess what, that internal citation, which has the first word of the works cited entry in it. So you know that if you're looking for something in the paper that's based on the works cited page, okay, well that first word, which is alphabetized, mind you, on the works cited page, is poking its little head out. That's what you're looking for in the internal citations in the body of the essay itself. And moreover, if you want to go from the body of the essay back to the works cited page, that word that you're looking for from the internal citation is again going to be poking its little head out the left-hand side in an alphabetized format on the works cited page. So it makes things easier to go back and forth, to use those sources in a meaningful, intelligent way that they're intended to be used, okay? And of course, I just define here, in case you weren't familiar with it in any fashion, what a hanging indent is. I already explained that. Don't need to go into any more depth on that subject, okay? So that's a lot of stuff. And if I had been concerned about you actually memorizing it, it would have taken me a lot longer to clarify all of that. But again, this is about introducing you to things so you get a big picture. I don't expect you to memorize this stuff. It's a jumping off point so that when you actually start to pour through the Purdue OWL, you're not completely lost and unsure of, are you barking up the right tree or not, as you're creating works cited entries and internal citations. So I'll shut up there. As always, bring any questions or concerns you may have if any issues should happen to arise. Other than that, I wish you good luck, guys, and I will see you shortly.